Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Yudalid of Makkot. We are on the first of the wide lines of on Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Um, and yesterday we had a three-way machlokas. We had Rabbi Yishmael, who had the viewpoint that you're going to get makot, you're going to get lashes in connection with any sin that, of course, you're supposed to get lashes for, where the Torah says that you get lashes. In addition, you'll get lashes for any sin that is subject to kares and any sin that's subject to death by the court. So whether it's death by heaven, death by court, being cut off by, all of them, you would get lashes. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He's like, no, if you get lashes, if you are supposed to be killed by the court, then you're not going to get lashes. But if you have kares, then if the punishment of a sin is kares, then you will get lashes. And that is what we saw in our Mishnah. That was how we got into the topic, because our Mishnah gave us that viewpoint, including many sins that are subject to kares, and noting the fact that they're getting lashes. And then the third viewpoint is Rabbi Yitzchak, who says, no, you don't get lashes for any sin other than those sins for which it says in the Torah that you get lashes. So any sin that's a kares or mises based in, you're not going to get lashes. So those are the three different viewpoints that we saw yesterday. And we have been explaining the machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And if we just focus on Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, they only disagree about cases of misos bastin, when the court is going to kill the person for having sinned. So in those cases, Rabbi Yishmael says you get lashes, and Rabbi Akiva says you don't get lashes. Now, we have understood that machlokas to mean, according to Rabbi Yishmael, that you get both penalties, that you both get that first they lash you and then they kill you. And that was the explanation, was the fact is that lashes is part of the killing. And so that was consistent with Rabbi Yishmael's philosophy. In fact, Rabbi Yishmael, I believe, way back in Sanhedrin, said that we need 23 judges to impose lashes, because lashes are part of death. And so as a result, that's why you would need 23 judges. It's not enough to have just 3 judges. So you need to have the same kind of court that would handle a capital case. So that's the same Rabbi Yishmael. So that is the machlokas that we've been discussing. And our first explanation as to why Rabbi Akiva disagrees, what the disagreement is about, is when we say kidei rish aso, that you're only going to be punished for one wickedness. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, look, it's all one penalty. It's not a different penalty, and therefore it's not going to be considered two rishayot. It's not going to be considered two wickednesses. But when it comes to Rabbi Akiva, he would say, no, it is considered two wickednesses. We don't treat malchus, lashes, just like a death penalty. And you want to say, well, what about kares and lashes? Why don't we say that? Because when we're talking about the wickednesses that are being punished, that we only punish one wickedness, not two, we're talking about court-based punishments. And so as a result, that's why Rabbi Akiva would say, no, we were only going to have one of death or lashes. We're not going to give both, because we only give one court-based punishment. So that was the machlokas as we understood it yesterday. And now Rava comes with a radical approach and says, you know what? We're not actually talking about somebody who's subject to the death penalty and also giving them lashes as a result of their sin. Rather, we're dealing with a different situation completely. Let's take a look. Rava Amar, first wide line on Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Rava Amar Asrube Likatala. So the witnesses warn the person that he would be liable to the death penalty. If that's in fact the case, well then Kuli Amalo Pligi de Ein Loco Mace. Of course, if the person actually got warned about the death, that they were going to be killed, and they then went ahead and took the action, the only penalty is going to be death. But ki pligi, where do Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva argue? They argue the asru be lemalchus, where the witnesses gave him warning only about Malchus. Rabbi Yishmael savar lav shanitan la'azharas misas based in loket alav, that when it comes to Rabbi Yishmael, he believes that when one can receive Malchus for prohibiting for a prohibition that's only warned about the death penalty. For Rabbi Akiva savar lav shanitan la'azharas misas based in Ain Loken Alav. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, once we give the warning associated with this, we're not going to give somebody, once the Torah gives a warning that you're going to get the death penalty, you don't get lashes. And so in Rabbi Akiva's view, once the Torah tells us that you're going to get a capital penalty, so then it does not include lashes. That's it. And so as a result, if somebody warns about lashes because they thought the penalty was lashes, well, the perpetrator is a lucky guy. He is going to get off. Okay. So the Rabbi Akiva, 1 second, ihachi chayav increases nami lav shenitan lazharas karesu. Well, 1 second. If the idea is that once the Torah warns us about the penalty of death, we're not going to give lashes, what about the warnings that are in the Torah about the penalty of kares? Shouldn't that also prevent us from giving lashes? And yet Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that when you have a kares situation, you do give lashes. So Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi, Hachi Amar Avimi Mahagronia Mishmei de Rava. So here's what Avimi said in the name of Rava that helps us understand how we answer that question. Chayave krisos lo tzrichi hasra. That when it comes, now this word hasra, of course, can mean a warning that witnesses give to the perpetrator. But here, that's not what this means. What it means actually is the warning that the Torah gives. Again, as a reminder, in addition, every time the Torah tells us that there is a penalty for something, the Torah has to give a separate pasuk that tells us that the action is also prohibited. And if it doesn't do that, well, then that's going to be a problem, and we're not going to be able to impose that penalty. And so the point is that what Rava is saying is that kares doesn't need that warning. So as long as you have one pasuk, so then that's fine. And so therefore, when the Torah does give us a warning, what the Torah is giving us a warning about in connection with kares situations is that, you know what? You're going to be subject to lashes. So that's the concern. So Sharei, and how do I know that? Sharei Pesach Umila. Anash afal pishalo is here, right? We have a general rule, or when it comes to the positive commandments of that one is obligated to bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach, so we can call this a little bit of a Daf Yomi coincidence because we just finished Pesach on Sunday. And when it comes to Mila, if you fail to circumcise yourself, if your parents haven't circumcised you, well then Anash Afal Pi Shalo Hizir. Those only have a penalty of kares, but they don't have a separate warning that's associated with them, and yet you are going to get kares. So now the Gemara asks, Vidilma Azhara Lakar. So that's the proof that you don't need a warning, because both Pesach and Mila don't have a warning, and yet we know that you get kares. So Dilma Azhara Lakorban, maybe that the warning that exists in connection with every other kares situation is not to tell us that in fact you're going to be subject to lashes, but rather to tell us that if you violate it accidentally or without realizing what the law is, well, then you'll be subject to a sin offering. Because when it comes to a failure to circumcise and failure to bring a Pesach offering, those are situations, those are sins for which one does not bring a sin offering. And so as a result, maybe what is going on is that it's not about the warning being for being for Malchus. The warning is to tell us about the fact that you'd be subject to a sin offering. No. Hasam lav hainu time. That's not the reason. Rather, the reason that they are not subject to a chatas is not because there is no warning. Elamishum de itkash kol Torah kula lavodas kochavim. No, because when the Torah tells us about a sin offering situation, it's telling us that it has to be a sin comparable to idolatry. That when it comes to idolatry, a person can sit and not act. So as a result, that's the key, right? The key is not serving idolatry. That's what the Torah is commanding us to do. So when is it that you're going to be subject to a sin offering? It's when you fail to sit and do nothing. But when it comes to the failure to circumcise and the failure to bring a korban, that is not a failure to sit and do nothing. That is sitting and doing nothing. And so as a result, you're not going to have to be obligated in a korban chatas. So avkol sheval tase la pukehani dekum vase. These are both situations where the Torah is telling us to get up and do something. And so as a result, that is why we are not going to say that these are subject, that the warning is what's telling us that it's subject to a chatas, but rather the warning is what tells us it's subject to a to lashes. So
okay, there is no warning for these two from Pesach.
For those two, there's no warning.
But so do they get, then they don't get lashes, right?
Right, correct. They don't get lashes. For everything else we're talking about, for every other lo tase, that's what that gets kares.
Well, those aren't lo tase.
For every other mitzvah that gets kares. Sorry, I should have said it that way. You're absolutely right. Those are ases that get kares. And so the difference is when it comes to those two ases, we don't have warnings. But when it comes to every other lotase that you're subject to kares, we do have warnings. And so the Gemara explains that that according to Rava, that the reason that we have those warnings is because Rabbi Akiva says that those warnings are to tell us about lashes. So we now have two different viewpoints on the machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Viewpoint number one is
are those the only is it
correct? Those
are only assays that involve karet?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So we now have two different approaches to the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva again saying that Misa's based in no lashes. Rabbi Yishmael saying Misa's based in lashes. So explanation number one is that, and this is really all an explanation of Rabbi Akiva's viewpoint. Explanation number one of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak is that the one punishment rule applies only to court-enforced punishments. Okay, Rava, and that what we're really talking about is that according to Rabbi Yishmael, even if you're subject to the death penalty, we're going to lash you first. Rava says, no, that can't be. It's got to be that if you're subject only to the death penalty, you're going to be, if you're subject to the death penalty, you only get killed. You're not going to also get lashes. And therefore, the machlokas, Rabbi Akiva's viewpoint is that Torah warnings for kares are are really warnings about lashes, and Torah warnings about the death penalty are warnings about the death penalty and not lashes. And so whereas Rabbi Yishmael says, no, the warning for the death penalty also includes lashes because lashes is a minor form of a death penalty. And finally, now we have Ravina. Ravina is going to go back to our original understanding. La'ol Ra Ravina Amar, as we turn it over to Yudalat Amadal, Kidda Amrinan. It's as we said originally, namely that we're talking about a situation where you are going to get malchus, you're going to get lashes and the death penalty, according to Rabbi Yishmael. And the point is that why aren't you going to get the malchus for a death penalty sin? It's because we have this rule of one penalty. No, kim lebederabamine shim asu tshuva. Because the bottom line is if you did tshuva, based in shalmala mochlin lehen, the heavenly courts will forgive you. So my amra. How do you? What about? Sorry, let me just finish this couple lines. My amra. So what exactly we said when we said that answer before? We had a problem because lo avid tshuva. This guy hasn't yet done tshuva. So as a result, maybe we should subject him to the kimle b'derabba mine and only have him be subject to kares. And then when he does tshuva, so then we'll give him lashes then. So lo psika milsa lechares. No, because it's not for sure that the kares is going to happen. That's already enough to say that kimle b'derabba mine does not apply, and we can apply lashes. And so as a result, that's the answer. That we do have a strict rule of one punishment, but when one of the punishments is not certain because it's being imposed by heaven, well, then we're going to say that's not actually a punishment, and therefore we can give lashes. And that is Rabbi Akiva's viewpoint, whereas again, Rabbi Yishmael would say, even death and lashes are only one penalty. And so as a result, we can give both. So that is the three different viewpoints that we have about the machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Now, do you have a question, Ken?
Yeah, what was that case? You were talking about karet, but both of them agree that there's a possibility for tshuva, right? And both of them agree they can get lashes and karet, right? Is that right?
Yes, both of them agree that.
So what was this last case? What was the case that you just discussed now? According to who's
we're discussing death penalty and lashes.
Oh, you're talking about mitat beitin.
Yes.
Oh, so that was one.
And that's where they disagree. Rabbi Yishmael says Mises Beistin does get lashes, and Rabbi Akiva says Mises Beistin does not get lashes. And so what is the point of their disagreement? The question is do we say that it's one penalty or is it two penalties? When it comes to death penalty, it's clearly Rabbi Yishmael says it's one penalty. Rabbi Akiva says it's two penalties. Well, okay. Well, if Rabbi Akiva says that's two penalties, why isn't kares and lashes two penalties? And the answer is because
tshuva.
Right, because it's because of the possibility of doing tshuva. So the penalty on of kares is not a certainty, and therefore we need to. It's not considered a second penalty.
So both of them would hold person could do tshuva.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Both of them hold that you could do tshuva, and both of them hold that lashes and kares, that kares gets lashes. Both of them agree to that. And now we're going to go back to Rebbe Yitzchak. That was the third viewpoint. And remember, he says no lashes for death penalty and no lashes for kares.
I want to ask a question that it might be a little aside, but what would be the penalty for not doing Korban Pesach if one isn't able to, and then does Pesach Sheni, for instance, or a person cannot do a Brit Milah because, let's say, two children had Brit Milah and died. So is there any
There's no penalty. In both those situations, there's no penalty.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, Chayav Krisus Bichlal Hayu. Chayav Krisus is a general statement. And so Vilama Yatzos Kares Ba'achoso. And so why did we need to say a separate repetition of kares with respect to having relations with one sister? Laduna b'kares v'lo b'malchus, to tell us specifically that you're only subject to kares and not subject to malchus. And that is why Rabbi Yitzchak says, he agrees with Rabbi Akiva that death penalties and lashes are considered two different penalties, and so we're not going to apply both. But even when it comes to malchus, yes, you're right that Rabbi Akiva, that it's not a definite penalty, and so therefore maybe it won't count as towards the two penalty rule, but no two penalty rule, but there's a special limud that we can make, a special learning that we can make, because kares is specifically mentioned an extra time in connection with relations with one sister. V'Rabbanan, well, 1 second, what do the rabbis do with that? Kares ba'achoso lamali, why is it necessary to say that? L'chalek, it's to indicate your required multiple sin offerings. Look at the Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Yochanan says, the Rabbi Yochanan, she'im asa an kulan behelam echad, if you have relations with a bunch of different women with whom you're not allowed to have relations, chayiv, because you didn't realize that it was prohibited for some reason, chayiv al kol achas va'achas. On each one, you're going to be liable for a separate sin offering. The Rebbe Yitzchak. So now, Rebbe Yitzchak, how does he learn l'chalek minale? How does he learn that there's separate separate sin offerings for each time. Nafgale ve'el isha benidas tumasa. It says isha in a pasuk that it isn't necessary to. It could just say ve'el nida bitumasa. It could have just said a nida in her tuma. Why did it need to say a woman? Of course, it's a woman. So, as Rashi says, "Demati lemechtav vilanida lo takrev." Don't come close to a nida. So lechayev al kol isha veisha. So that tells us that every different kind of woman that you have relations with is going to make you liable for a separate sin offering. Why don't the rabbis let the learn from this extra woman? You know what? You're right. They do learn from that. So as a result, well, now we go back to our original question. Why do we need to have a separate reference to kares in connection with the sister? So if you have relations with three people whose prohibition to you is because they're a sister, maybe you might only think that you would be subject to one chatas offering. So now you're going to be telling, now the fact that we're going to reference it, that we're going to reference kares again with respect to a sister. So we're going to say that teaches us that all three of these women you would be liable to. So who are the three women that are sisters? One is the person's sister himself, one is his father's sister, and one is his mother's sister. Any three, if you have relationship with all three of those people, I might have thought that, again, they're all punished because of sisterhood. So, and therefore, maybe it's one sin offering if you have relations with all three. No, you get three separate sin offerings. Pshita, but that's obvious. Hare Gufin Muchlakin, Hare Shemus Muchlakim. They aren't really the same name, and they aren't really the same person. So of course you're going to get three different lashes. So as a result, the Gemara says no. We're dealing with a situation, a crazy situation, where a person's sister is also the sister of his father and the sister of his mother. So how in the world can that happen? So veheki mishkakas law. How do you find that? Barishia barishia, where you have two sinners, one who's the son of the other. So let's take a look at Rashi. It's Rashi 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 lines down on the narrow lines, right-hand side, Yudalit Amud Aleph. Berishia, Shparishia, Haba al Imo. So the first step is that a son has relations with his mother. The holy Shtei Banos, and now he has two daughters,
right,
with his mother. So those daughters are his half sisters and his own daughters.
right.
Okay, the Chazar Uba al Achas Mehen, and then he has relations with one of these two daughters who are his half sisters. Okay, and the holy Ben, and now he has a son. Okay, Uba haben al Achosimo, and the son has relations to the sister, to the other one of the sister of his mother, who is, right, Shehi. She is obviously the sister of his mother, right? That's clear because that's who she is. But she's also Achoso. She's also his sister because his father and her father are the same person.
Correct.
Right? And Ba'achos Aviv. And she's also the sister of his father because his father and this woman have the same mother.
Terrible
so it's a
relationship.
terrible situation. But that is how you can have one person who is both the person's sister, his mother's sister, and his father's sister. Awful. Okay, so that's what we're telling us. And what
You're
we're
thinking
telling us
about the ages of these people, though.
Yes,
I mean,
you have.
I mean, that's a big stretch, though.
Well, I mean, again, in today's modern world, it's very easy to imagine something like this happening because you have people who are in their 80s marrying people who are in their 20s. So, I mean, that's not actually that kind of crazy. But all right, in any event, let's not even focus on it. It's terrible even to think about. But Rabbi Yitzchak Hamanalei. So, okay, so now, and so this is what the rabbis learn from the fact that there's an extra reference to kares when it comes to having incest with one sister. So where does Rebbe Yitzchak, namely that you have to do 3 sin offerings for this situation? Hamanalei, how does he derive this rule? So Nafkalei Mikal V'chomer. Our initial thought is to say that he learns it from a Kal V'chomer, Titania, because we have a Mishnah that is, although it says Titania, which is usually a brisa, this is actually a Mishnah, and so the Bach actually changes it to Titnan. Amar Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva says, Sha'alti es Rabbi Gamliel v'Rabbi Yoshua be'itliz shel imus, she'imum, excuse me, that he posed the question to Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua in the meat market of Imum. So shahalchu likach behema, because they had gone there to buy an animal. So lemishne beno shel Rabbi Gamliel, because they were going to prepare the animal for the feast of Rabbi Gamliel's son, who was getting married. So you can imagine now this question by one of the Talmidim in the marketplace while they're busy trying to prepare for the wedding. You can only imagine the tremendous patience that Rebbeim are supposed to have. Habal achoso shehi achos aviv shehi achos imo mahu. What is the rule if one has relations with his sister, who is also his father's sister and his mother's sister?
That's where they had this question in the marketplace?
Yes, that's exactly right. Oh, Mark, they could use your help.
Okay.
So
That's a crazy place.
I'll get the bottles afterwards, okay?
That's a crazy place to have this discussion.
Yes, that's exactly the point. And so you can learn a couple of things. One is we can learn that even in the marketplace, the Rebbe needs to be able to answer questions to his students. You can also you also can learn the greatness of Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua, that they were able to answer this. So, but let's take a look. Let's keep the question going. Do we say that you're only liable to one sin offering? Or are you liable on each and every name? So Amrulo, they said to him, Zolo Shaman, we never heard this particular law. We didn't hear this question before. You've got a good question about Shamanu, but we have heard that if you have relations with 5 different women who are in a state of nida, well, then you're going to be subject to 5 separate sin offerings. Nirin dvarim mikal v'chomer, and it would seem like there could be a kal v'chomer.
It says that's sort of one event or one thought or one.
Yes, exactly. With one lapse of attention. Exactly. 100%. That's very key. Because
so there are 5 women within the Tochadei Dibur, essentially?
No. Helem echad just means that he never realized that it was prohibited during the middle. Okay. So uman nida shehi shem echad. When in this case, it's one prohibition. It's just the same prohibition. But chayav al kol achas v'achas, and yet you're liable to 5 different sin offerings. Kan sheshlosh shemos lo kol shekain. Well, then in the situation where they have 3 different names, you should certainly be subject to it. So v'idach, and why don't the rabbis agree with that? Because kal v'chomer prichahu. It's a problematic kal v'chomer. Mala nida shekain gufin muchlakin. In the case of nida, there's 5 different women. So you can't compare 5 different women with one name to 1 woman with 3 different names. It's just different. It's not, you can't necessarily say that one is more likely than the other. Ula idach nami. Well, 2nd, Rabbi Yitzchak should also say, ha vadai kal v'chomer prichahu. It also should be a problematic kal v'chomer. So we're back to our question. How does Rabbi Yitzchak learn that having relations with somebody who's a sister, the mother's sister and the father's sister all at the same time, that is subject to 3 sin offerings? How does Rabbi Yitzchak learn that? So
how do you say it's 3? How do you say it's one name? There are 3 separate people in that case, right?
In which case?
In the case of the sisters, right? There are still 3 separate. There's still
there's one person, 3 names.
Oh,
the same woman is the man's sister his mother's
Oh,
sister
oh, it's one.
and the
Okay.
father's sister. So
Okay.
it's one woman, but three names. Elanafgale mi achoso de seifa. So we're going to learn it from the second reference to sister in that verse, because the pasuk says this is Perek Kaf of Vayikra. So I guess maybe it's two parshios from now. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. V'ish asher yikach as achoso bas avivu vasimo v'ra'a es ervasa v'hisir es ervaso chesed hu v'nichrasu le'enei b'nei amam ervas achoso gila avono yisa. So again, but asher yikach es achoso is one reference, and then achoso again is referenced again. So we see the second reference, which suggests that there's a separate sin offering for each of the women, for each of the names associated with the one woman with whom he has relations. The Idach, well, okay, well, now you've got this separate lesson that Rabbi Yitzchak uses from the reference to Achoso, the second to Achoso. So Achoso de Sefer Lamali, what do the rabbis do with that Achoso? So Lachaivo al Achoso basavivu basimo. No, it's to tell us that when it's when that the full sister is also liable for incest, because the Torah, interestingly, only tells us that the problematic sisters for having relations are the sister of your father or the sister of your mother. But what about if the person's a sister of both? Now, I might have said, well, of course, it's a kal v'chomer, but we're going to say, lomar she'ein onshin min adin. But the point is by telling us achoso here, we're teaching a separate lesson. And that lesson is that we do not use a kal v'chomer to teach us a punishment. That you can't say that because X sin is worse than Y sin, that if Y gets a certain punishment, then X should also get that punishment. Right. You cannot say that, because in fact, there are several reasons. One could be that it's just exeris akasiv, but if we want to think about the philosophy, it could also be, yes, you might be right that the X sin is worse than Y sin, but it could be that the reason that we give you that punishment for Y is because we're going to allow you to get atonement through that. But your new sin is way worse. So maybe we won't give you that opportunity for atonement. Or alternatively, maybe you're wrong and X is not really a more severe sin than Y. So there are a number of reasons why we might not say that. So, but the bottom line is that the language that Rabbi Yitzchak is currently using to tell us that if you have relations with your sister, who's your father's sister, who's your mother's sister, that you have three different sin offerings, that's the language that the rabbis use to tell us ein onshin min adin, that we don't use a kal v'chomer to create a penalty. So v'idach, how does Rabbi Yitzchak learn that? So ibayis ema gamar onish me'azhara, that he derives the punishment from the fact that we have a warning. When the Torah warns against having relations with a half-sister, it states the extra time she is your sister, right? It says, Ervas bas eshes avicha moledes avicha, achoscha hi, lo sigale ervasa. It didn't need to say achoscha hi in that pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud Chet, Pasuk Yud Aleph. And so because it didn't need to say it there, therefore it's going to say, it's telling us that you can't say ein onshin min adin. V'ibayis ema nafgale, or alternatively, he can learn it from, and we turn to Yudalim a bet, me'achoso dereisha. No, the first time it says achoso in that pasuk, in Perek Kaf, pasuk Yud Zayin, because it says the isha sher yikach es achoso basaviv o basimo. It didn't need to say achoso and basaviv o basimo. Of course, who is your basaviv but your sister? And who is your basimo but your sister? So it didn't need to say it in the first place. So as a result, but second though, those are both great answers. So v'idach, what do Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva do with this explanation of the sister? So ahumi boile lechalek kares lemifatem ulasach. They use these additional references to teach us a rule that is totally unrelated to having relations, because we have a principle that once when you have something extra in a verse and you no longer have the ability to learn anything in that topic, we will say im eno inyan. And we will say that, okay, we can now use that to tell us something completely different. And so we are going to learn it about somebody who compounds, who makes the anointing oil, and somebody who uses the anointing oil that Moshe compounded. And so as a result, each of those people are going to get separate punishments.
In relation to this kal v'chomer, before we go into another topic, sort of, is that a cloud that we can't learn a kal v'chomer from one
yes, ein onshin min adin, and
onshin.
Ein onshin min adin is an absolute general rule. I don't know whether there's anybody who argues with it, but it certainly seems like it's a general rule that everybody applies, that we do not use inferences to determine what the punishment is for something.
There were so many discussions of kal v'chomer throughout Shas.
100%. And anytime the kal v'chomer seems to be about a penalty, we will immediately ask, oh, ve'ein onshin min adin. That's exactly, you're absolutely right. And whenever we see that, whenever you see that, you should be thinking ein onshin min adin, and you will find that 99.9% of the time, I don't know, I don't want to say it's 100% because I haven't been through Shas yet, but we're going through it now together. So the point is that you'll find that they'll ask the question. They'll ask the question, hey, 1 second, ein onshin min adin. You're exactly right. The idach, so what does Rabbi Yitzchak do in order to tell us that somebody who uses the anointing oil or makes the anointing oil is going to be subject to separate chata oath offerings? Sabak Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Hoshaya. He thinks like Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Hoshaya. To Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Hoshaya. Kol makom she'ata motze shnei lavin v'kares echad. When you have two prohibitions and one mention of kares, chaluk and hein lekarban, then it is still considered separate sin offerings. Because I might have thought that you only have one. Bottom line is you can apply two. And so as a result, Rabbi Yitzchak doesn't need the reference to achoto to teach us in connection with making oil and using oil, that you get two separate sin offerings. The or alternatively, lo savar la Rabbi Elazar. He doesn't agree with Rabbi Elazar. In the name of Rabbi Hoshaya, he doesn't agree that you can learn it without a scriptural source. That in fact, that the same basic principle would apply when it comes to if a man has relations with a menstruating woman and they are going to incur kares. Again, the Torah doesn't need to tell us this, and so as a result, the Torah reiterates kares in regard to a nida, even though this punishment is already known from the general statement of kares made in reference to all forbidden unions. And so as a result, this reiteration requires a separate chatas for the sin of nida, and by extension, the sins of all other forbidden unions. But we already knew that because of the separate reference of kares by a sister. So as a result, we say im eno inyan, and therefore, just as the rabbi said with respect to compounding and anointing, so that's where Rabbi Yitzchak would say compounding and anointing is going to be problematic. The idach, well, 1 second. So what do if
we know the general rule from about nida from one pasuk? Is that it?
We learn from the extra reference to kares by nida to the fact that if you engage in both making anointing oil and using anointing oil by accident, you're going to be subject to two separate sin offerings. And you'll say, well, what do they have to do with each other? You're exactly right. They have nothing to do with each other. The point is that because we have an extra reference to kares, for which we have no reason to understand what it's used for, the tradition is that extra reference is telling us that you get two separate sin offerings if you do both the compounding and the anointing in the same, even if the same time at the same lack of knowledge. And so
now I'm asking him also about the nida. There's only one reference which tells us all about all karet regarding
So,
Nida?
so we know we have a reference, a general reference that all of the immoral relationships all get kares. That we have a general statement at the very begin. I think it's at the very beginning, but basically a general statement in connection with all the relationships that say kares. But when it comes to two of them, it repeats the reference to kares. So when it comes to the sister, we understand that it's telling us that that if you had one moment of lack of knowledge about the prohibition, even though you had relations with all different kinds of women, you're going to be subject to a sin offering for each and every one of them, even though it was only one lack of knowledge moment. And so now, what do we do with the time it says kares also separately and unnecessarily in connection with a menstruating woman, with a woman who's a nida? So that we're going to use, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, we're going to use that to tell us that if you were to engage in making anointing oil or using anointing oil, and you did that both in one moment of uncertainty, you would end up with two separate sin offerings, not just one. Even though when it came to the commandment about those two things, it only references kares a single time. Okay, so Ahumi Boile, look at the Rabbi Yochanan. So what does the rabbis, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, do with the fact that it references kares in connection with a nida? So they need it like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai minayin she'ein ha'isha tameya ad sheyetzi madve derech ervasa. How do I know that the woman is not going to become tamei until the blood actually exits her? So v'shene'amar v'isha sher yishkav es isha davav v'gila es ervasa, that he needs to uncover her nakedness. And so as a result, the point is that it doesn't really need to say he uncovers her nakedness. The gila as ervasa. That's kind of obvious because it's yishkav es isha. He's sleeping with her. So melamed she'ein ha'isha tmeya ad sheyetzi mad v'derech ervasa. So as a result, that teaches us that it's not going to that until she's not actually tamei until it comes out. And so as a result, that's how that's what they will do with this extra reference to kares. And so as a result, now we've got the everything worked out. And so we have now effectively understood Rabbi Yitzchak's position, and we understand why he disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we now go back to our Mishnah. We're at the two dots on your
At
dollar.
the beginning, so we were talking about achoto. That was, we were learning the whole thing, right? So there was the reference in the Mishnah talking about how we that was a sin of karet, right? Or right, achoto, his sister.
Well, it's the sin of kares, and our Mishnah says that you get lashes.
So
that's how we got onto this.
Right.
Because,
so the
right,
question
because
I
Rabbi
have,
Akiva, our Mishnah is only consistent with Rabbi Akiva.
Right. So my question is, if the punishment there with achoto is karet, then and we want to learn that and why do we have the other sisters and other sisters? I'm wondering, why does the Gemara not say that the additional that there's a penalty of karet for each of them, rather than, how do we get to the point from saying it's karet to a chatat? I would think, we want to answer, it's karet for this one and karet for this one. Then the question, how do you get karet more than one time? Right? That doesn't make sense.
You're
so
absolutely right.
How do we get to chatat? That's the question, I guess.
So the chatas, so the general rule is that a chatas offering is a sin where the penalty is, I believe, kares or worse. And so as a result, that you did accidentally.
That's shogeg.
The shogeg, exactly. So we're dealing with a shogeg situation. And you're absolutely right. Maybe you can't get two death penalties. But you can have two sin offerings. And so we regularly talk about it. We had this throughout Masechta Shabbos, right? And so often when we say chayiv, we're really talking about the sin offering chayiv and not the chayiv for the death penalty, because that requires the warning, etc. And so the point is that that's the what the idea is that we already, so the because of the tying together of kares and sin offering, the additional reference to kares that we didn't need is telling us that each sin gets a separate sin offering, even though you had one moment of a lack of knowledge. And, clearly, if you have multiple moments of lack of knowledge, you'll be subject to multiple sin offerings. But even though there's only one moment that you didn't realize that all these sins were not prohibited, you didn't realize that all these sins were prohibited, and so you went ahead and you did them all, even though there was only one moment, because each of the sins are not just grouped together as one lump sum, but rather have a separate reference to a kares. So as a result, we're going, which is not necessary. So as a result, we're going to not treat them all as one sin. We're going to treat them as separate, different categories of sins, and therefore you'd be subject to multiple sin offerings.
So in the case of Mazda, well, what would be the case then? What would be the punishment then? He can't get karet multiple times.
Well, technically, you may be able to get kares multiple times because we don't really fully understand what the punishment of kares is, because it's a heavenly based sin. So it could be that if you're subject to kares multiple times, it's worse than if you are only subject to it once. But the bottom line is that we're not dealing with an intentional warned person. We're dealing with a situation where the person wakes up and says, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this. I didn't realize that it was prohibited. I'm so glad you told me that it was prohibited, because now I can bring a sin offering and get atonement. And so the question is how many atonements does he need? How many sin offerings does he need? And the answer is one for each relationship. All right. The tummy she'achal as a kodesh, we said that a tummy person who eats a sacrificial food is going to also receive lashes, or somebody who enters the temple when they're tummy. So bishlam habala mikdash tummy. I totally understand, the Gemara says, why somebody who enters the base of Mikdash when they're tummy is going to get lashes. Ksiv onish uksiv azhara. We have both a separate punishment and a separate warning. Onish tiksiv es mishkan Hashem timei v'nichrisa, that if you went into the temple and you were tamei, you'll be cut off. So an azhara v'lo yitamu es machanayim, they shouldn't contaminate their camps. So as a result, we have both a prohibition and a warning. But ela tamei she'achal es a kodesh. But when it comes to somebody who's tamei who eats holy food, so bishlama onish ksiv, I know where the penalty is written. So we see that there's kares there, and it's talking about eating meat from a shlamim when the person is tamei. El azhara minayin. How do we have a warning? So we have a machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, and although this machlokas is really just about sources, it does seem like, even though the general rule is that where you follow Rabbi Yochanan, in this particular instance, we are going to follow Reish Lakish. But let's take a look. Reish Lakish says, B'chol kodesh lo siga. The Torah says, don't touch. And we are going to see at the end of today that touching in that particular instance must mean eating. We're going to see that shortly. So be patient with me and just understand, because kodesh lo tiga, we're going to understand it meaning eating. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Tane Bardala, that actually we have a gzera shava. Asya tumaso. The pasuk tumaso, the word tumaso is written both in Vayikra Zayin pasuk kaf and in where is the other one? And in Bamidbar Yotet, Pasuk Yud Gimel, and Ksiv Hachad V'Tumaso Alav V'Nichrasa, that when it comes to eating sacrificial food, you're going to be tamei. Uksiv Hasam Tamei Yiyeh O Tumaso Bo, and when it comes to entering the temple, that's also going to be a problem. So Malahalan Onish V'Hazhara, just as when it comes to entering the temple, we have both a punishment and a warning. So we're going to use, based on the Gzera Shava, we're going to use that warning, Avkan Onish V'Azhara. Even though we don't officially have a separate pasuk, we can use the Gzera Shava to effectively give us the Azhara when it comes to eating. So Bishlam Reish Lakish Lo Amar Rabbi Yochanan. I understand why Reish Lakish would not say like Rabbi Yochanan. This is a remarkable statement, Gzera Shava Lo Gamir, because he never actually learned this Gzera Shava. Now that's very odd, because Rabbi Yochanan was his teacher. So how could it be that he never received this Gzera Shava? So there are a number of different interesting answers, but the bottom line is it's interesting to note that he did not on some level, he did not have this tradition. Ella Rabbi Yochanan, my time alo Amar Karesh Lakish. Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan agree with Reish Lakish? Amar Lach, he would say to you, Hahu as Harala Truma. No, the warning of B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga is not about eating, it's about eating true. I mean, maybe it's about eating, but it's eating truma, not kodesh food that was on the altar. It's a different kind of kodesh. The Reish Lakish Azhar Truma Minale. How does he have a warning associated with truma if Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan uses it for truma? So where does Reish Lakish have that warning? So Nafkale Ish Mizera Aharon V'Hu Tzarua Ozav. We have, and then the pasuk continues that he shall not eat sacred foods until he purifies himself. So the point is that anybody who's the children of Aaron and is Tzarua or Zav and is therefore Tameh is not allowed to have the food until he purifies himself. And what kind of food are we talking about? Ezehu davar shehu shava bizarro shel Aaron. Why does it say the children of Aaron as opposed to the sons of Aaron? So heavy omer zo truma. It's the only thing that both men and women have the ability to eat fully is truma, and so it must be referring to truma. The idach. So Rabbi Yochanan, why doesn't he learn exactly from the same source as Reish Lakish? Hahula achila, v'hala nagia. No, the verse about Aaron and his son and his offspring, that's telling us about eating truma. But this pasuk is talking about touching truma while tameh, and both are needed. It's not sufficient to have just for eating and not for touching. The Reish Lakish, Hi b'kol kodesh lo tiga lahachihu da'asa. No, are you telling me that it's coming to, specifically, I don't say, and so as a result, and Reish Lakish says, no, b'chol kodesh lo siga lahachihu da'asa. It's actually coming to tell us about, not about, touching, but about eating. Hahumi baile l'tamei shenaga b'kodesh. But 1 second, why doesn't he also need it for touching? De itmar. After all, he himself says that the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga is for touching, because listen to the following statement: Tamei shenaga b'kodesh. If you have somebody who's tamei who touches sacrificial food, Reish Lakish Omer Loka, he gets lashes. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Eino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan says he doesn't get lashes. Reish Lakish Omer Loka, because B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga, it specifically says you shouldn't touch sacred foods. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Ein Loka Hahu Azhar Truma Hudasa, because he learns it for truma. So we wanted to say that Reish Lakish was only learning eating from the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga, but it's clear from this teaching that Reish Lakish says that this is also referring to touching holy foods and not truma. So how can you also say that it's also a warning for eating? It should be only a warning for touching. So tamei shenaga b'kodesh mid'apke rachmana b'loshen negia. No, when it comes to a tamei who's touching food, we're learning it from the prohibition. We learn the prohibition against eating based on touching. Azhara itkush kodesh lemikdash, and we have the warning based on the connection of kodesh to the mikdash, of entering the temple, to comparing it to sacrificial food. That just as you can't enter the temple if you're tamei, you can't have sacrificial food. And that comparison is telling us that the both are punishments of kares. But you know what? The problem, and Rashi goes through this in greater detail, but we're running out of time, that the point is that touching sacrificial food is not subject to kares. That's the problem. So you can't say when we have B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga, it can't just be about touching sacrificial food, according to Reish Lakish, because touching sacrificial food is not subject to kares. And so as a result, what we end up doing is he says, when it comes to kares, the phrase B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga is telling us that you can't eat it because that's talking about kares. But still, we're not going to take the words out of their plain meaning, and you still can't touch it either. And in that situation, you would be subject to lashes. 1 second, I can still say, are you telling me that when it comes to the pasuk, B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tziga, that's only coming to Hahumi Baile L'Tami She'achal Basar Kodesh Lifnei Zrikas Damim? 1 second, we also have a separate concept that the question is when is the problem about eating the tamei food? That according to Reish Lakish uses the verse of B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga to say that a tamei person who eats the sacrificial food before the throwing of the blood upon the altar.
Why'd you say tamei food? Is the food tamei or the person tamei?
Thank you. My apologies. Eating the sacrificial food. You're absolutely right. I should have said sacrificial food. So the Kodesh food. So the tummy person's eating the Kodesh food before the throwing of the blood of that sacrifice onto the altar. To Idmar, because we have the following statement that shows that Reish Lakish is using this pasuk for that purpose. So tamei she'achal basar Kodesh lifnei zrikas damim. Reish Lakish omer loka. If you were a tummy person were to eat that food, even before the blood is thrown, you're still going to get lashes. Rabbi Yochanan Omer ain't a loka. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you don't get lashes. Reish Lakish Omer loka. Rabbi Yochanan says you get lashes because B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga. You can't touch. Again, we're going to understand that to mean eating, as we'll see in a moment. So as a result, you can't eat sacred food. So loshna lifnei zrika, loshna achar zrika. It doesn't make a difference. And why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan learn from that pasuk? Because Rabbi Yochanan Omer ain't a loka. Rabbi Yochanan L'tamei. Rabbi Yochanan follows his reasoning. To Amar Kra tumaso. He doesn't learn the lesson of not touching and not eating sacred food from B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga. He learns from that about truma. So that's going to be about truma. And when we have the concept of tumaso, that in the pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin pasuk Kaf, when it says tumaso in connection with the korban, it's talking about a korban because the end of the pasuk says that you're going to be able to, that a person who's tahor could eat the meat. It must be referring to after the throwing of the blood, because a tahor person can't eat the meat until after the blood is thrown. So given the fact that the end of the pasuk in Perek Zayin pasuk Kaf of Vayikra talks about being a tahor person eating the korban, it must be that the whole pasuk is talking about after the throwing of the blood. So ahi mikol kodesh nafka. No, the point is that the fact that it says bikol kodesh, that's how Rabbi Reish Lakish is going to learn it. So Tanya kivase de Reish Lakish, and in fact we have a brisa that teaches that the source for not eating sacred food is based on the word B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga. Azhara La'ochel. That B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga is actually a warning about eating. Ata Omer Azhara La'ochel. You want to say that it's a warning about eating. Oeinu Ela Azhara L'Nogea. Maybe it could just be a warning about touching. So Talmud Lomar B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga the El HaMikdash. The fact that we connect B'Kol Kodesh Lo Tiga, that you can't touch the Kodesh, and you can't go into the Beit HaMikdash. Makish Kodesh LeMikdash. We're connecting the food to the Beit HaMikdash. Ma Mikdash Davar Sheyesh Bo Natilas Neshama. When it comes to entering the Beit HaMikdash, when you're Tameh, that's subject to Kares. Af Kol Davar Sheyesh Bo Natilas Neshama. So the entire pasuk has to be talking about something for which one is subject to kares. So as a result, the inim benegias mi ikat netilas neshama. But if you only touch sacrificial food when you are tameh, are you subject to kares? No, you're not. So Ella ba'achila. So as a result, the pasuk b'chol kodesh lo tiga must be talking about achila, and that's exactly what what Reish Lakish says. And so as a result, we actually have a support for Reish Lakish's position in connection with this machlokas that he has with Rabbi Yochanan. And so,
wasn't Rabbi Yochanan talking largely about truma and not even about kodesh?
correct, because he says that pasuk is talking about truma. He doesn't use that pasuk to talk about. He doesn't use that pasuk to talk about anything else, and so that's exactly right.
So I mean, it seems like they're talking about two different things. One's talking about
Correct.
the wind, and one's talking about the sun. And how
Correct.
I mean, it's not even having a discussion with each other. It seems here's
Well,
one
they're
talking
learning.
about truma, and the other one's talking about kodesh.
Correct. 100%. Truma. Exactly.
Truma, right? Truma and kodesh. Truma
Correct.
versus
You're
kodesh.
absolutely right. They're talking about two different things. And that's why they have the various disagreements that they have. So, for example, again, according to Reish Lakish, you're going to get kares even if you eat the kodesh before the blood is thrown, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says you don't. And what was the other one? I don't remember the other one right off the top of my head. But the bottom line is you're absolutely right. That's why they disagree, because they have different sources for these different principles.
So what would Rabbi Yochanan hold regarding kodesh?
Well, he holds that you're not allowed to eat it. He definitely holds it. He just learns it from a Gzeira Shava. That was a Gzeira Shava of tumaso. So there are some things which they agree. They just have different sources. And then they have some things for which they disagree because of their different sources.
So he would still hold that you're not allowed to eat it.
Eat kodesh, absolutely.
What
But he would only apply the kares penalty to after the blood is thrown.
And well, that's correct, but shogi would be chatat, right?
Yes, and therefore you would only be subject to a sin offering after the blood has been thrown. Correct.
And he would, and what would Reish
Lakish would say it doesn't make a difference whether the blood has been thrown or not. No matter what, you're not allowed to do it, and so as a result, you'd be subject to a sin offering if you did it whether before or after the blood was thrown.
What does he hold regarding Nagia?
Nagia, everybody agrees that it's not subject to kares.
Is it subject to chata? No, I guess not.
No, I don't think it would be subject to chatas then.
And what would Rev Yochanan, Reish Lakish hold regarding truma, or they're not even discussing it?
Not even discussing it. Did they go through where his source is for truma? Now I'm not remembering.
Well, he doesn't even mention it. It's not even an issue for him at this point.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think to see. He learns the warning about truma. He learns from Ish Mizera Aharon Behutzarua Ozav. So that was the source that he had for the warning about truma. So he does have the same prohibition, and he learns it elsewhere.
I see. So he also holds
and the basic idea was Rabbi Yochanan felt that he needed two separate warnings, one for eating and one for touching, whereas Reish Lakish does not think that you need both warnings for each. You can just have one warning for both.
For truma.
It may be for both truma and for sacrificial food. It's definitely with respect to truma. Not 100% sure about sacrificial food.
That you need.
Does Reish Lakish need two separate verses, one for touching and one for eating? I think he uses the same verse.
Because he holds touching is
because he holds that touching is not subject to kares, so you don't need a separate. So I think he can learn he learns both of them in both cases together.
but both hold that touching is not,
Car race, correct.
is Nagia. So then, and yet Rav Yochanan needs two pasukim, one for Nagia and one for Achila, right?
Correct.
Even though he holds that Nagia is not subject to any penalty.
Well, remember that the Nagia and Achila that he needs two separate psukim for is in connection with Truma.
Okay.
All righty.
Right.
Have
Okay.
a
All
wonderful
right.
day.
Yeah,
We'll
you
pick
too.
up from there, God willing, tomorrow.
Okay. All right.